The year was 1352, and the Kingdom of England was a place of whispers and intrigue. In the heart of it all, King Edward III sat upon his throne, a man of power and privilege. Despite his grandeur, Edward was no stranger to controversy, but in the world of poetry, he was elevated to a status beyond reproach. The poet, in his boldness, chose Edward to preside over a heated debate, a debate that could have scandalized the monarchy, but instead celebrated it. Imagine a world where the king, known for his extravagant spending and indulgent lifestyle, was seen as the ultimate judge. In a time of social unrest and upheaval across Europe, this was no small feat. If the same poem had been written in France, the French King John might not have been so fortunate. And in Scotland, where King David II was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the notion of a king as a wise and fair judge would have been laughable. But in England, Edward was different. He was the man everyone looked to for leadership and justice. The poet's choice was a testament to Edward's authority and respect, even as he indulged in the trappings of his position. This was a vision of a society changing and growing, with the king at its center, guiding the way. Yet, just as this vision of Edward as a just and respected ruler was taking shape, a shadow loomed over Europe. On December 6, 1352, Pope Clement VI died and a new pope, Innocent VI, was elected. This change in the papal leadership brought a new player into the game, Cardinal Guy of Boulogne. Guy was a complex figure, seen by some as a genuine peacemaker, and by others as a self-serving courtier. Regardless of his motives, he had a unique advantage. He was the son of the Count of Boulogne and the uncle of the Queen of France. This made him a powerful mediator, capable of speaking directly to King John of France. Guy's mission was clear: to bring England and France to the negotiating table. He understood what Edward wanted: sovereignty over the lands he had fought for, and he knew that King John would have to make significant concessions to achieve peace. This was a challenging task, but it was one that Guy was determined to undertake. Meanwhile, Edward was not idle. He was overseeing the construction of his new house at Rotherhithe, a symbol of his ambition and wealth. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Duke of Lancaster, and the Bishop of Norwich were sent to Guynes to begin negotiations. They returned with a promising offer: sovereignty over Gascony in exchange for Edward dropping his claim to the French throne. This was a breakthrough, and it seemed that a permanent peace might finally be within reach. But Edward was a man of many thoughts. He was at Eltham that Easter, planning his new palace and enjoying the feast. He had considered giving up Brittany to Charles de Blois, who was still his prisoner, but a permanent peace with France was a new and daunting prospect. 16 years of war had taken their toll, and Edward found himself questioning what he truly wanted. Was his claim to the French throne more than just a bargaining chip? Could he actually become the King of France? The pressure was mounting, and Edward's indecision was palpable. He appointed John Avenel to take over the lieutenancy of Brittany, but he still hesitated on the matter of France. He held tournaments and celebrations, but the question of peace lingered in his mind. When Guy of Boulogne's proposals were met with resistance from King John, Edward's doubts grew. The French king was unwilling to give up sovereignty, and the negotiations stalled. Despite this setback, the attempt to secure peace had opened a crucial dialogue. What terms would Edward find acceptable? The question hung in the air, unresolved but necessary for any lasting peace. As the summer of 1353 approached, Edward's movements were telling. He left Westminster and traveled to Wiltshire, where he spent time hunting and falconing. But there was more to his absence from the capital than just recreation. On July 31st, the king's apothecary, John of Lucca, was paid a significant sum for medicines. Was Edward ill? The chroniclers, who often focused on more dramatic events, left this question unanswered. But the fact that Edward required medicines, and that his business slowed down during this period, suggests that he was facing some health challenges. Edward's illness, whatever it was, did not stop him for long. He moved to Gloucestershire and the Welsh Marches, visiting shrines and sending his sons to honor his late father. His recovery was swift, and he returned to Westminster, ready to face the challenges ahead. In September, Edward summoned his council with three main goals: to outlaw foreign courts dealing with English affairs, to request an extension of the subsidy, and to discuss the ordinance of the staple. The wool staple, a critical economic issue, was to be moved from Bruges to England, a move that would benefit English merchants and reduce Flemish influence. The council, though smaller than a full parliament, was a significant gathering. Edward listened to the representatives and agreed to their demands, passing statutes that addressed a range of issues, from the sale of cloth to the import of Gascon wine. This period of Edward's reign was marked by a deep engagement with his council and the people. He was a king who listened and responded, a lawmaker rather than a lawgiver. His parliaments were characterized by a two-way dialogue, a partnership between the king and his subjects. This was a time of growth and change, with Edward at the helm, guiding his kingdom through the complexities of war, peace, and governance. The year 1353 came to a close with the traditional Christmas feasts at Eltham. Edward's life, once defined by war and conquest, was now a tapestry of building projects, parliaments, and the routine of a peacetime king. But the challenges of the past were not forgotten, and the future held new uncertainties. Edward's reign was far from over, and the road ahead was yet to be fully revealed. In the mid-1350s, King Charles of Navarre was one of the most troublesome figures in French politics. He and his brother Philip were deeply involved in a plot that would set the stage for a major conflict. Charles and Philip were royal princes through both their father and mother, making them powerful and dangerous. Their mother, Jeanne, was the daughter of King Louis X, which gave Charles a claim to the French throne that rivaled even that of King John. Charles was also married to King John's daughter, which made the situation even more complex. In January 1354, Charles and Philip decided to eliminate a key ally of King John, Charles of Spain, the Constable of France. Philip and his men broke into Charles of Spain's inn and brutally murdered him, stabbing him 80 times. Philip then informed his brother Charles, who claimed responsibility, saying he had ordered the assassination. This act of violence was a direct challenge to King John's authority, and Charles knew he would face severe consequences. To protect himself, Charles sought the support of the Duke of Lancaster, hoping that an English army could invade France if it came to war. Lancaster, in turn, consulted Edward III of England, who proposed a deal. Charles would support Edward's claim to the French throne, and in return, Edward would help Charles gain control of parts of France. Charles, desperate for any kind of support, agreed to these demands. However, Charles was not as sincere as Lancaster and Edward. When Cardinal Guy of Boulogne, a skilled diplomat, arranged a meeting between Charles and King John, Charles accepted John's offer of forgiveness and substantial gifts. This reconciliation effectively sealed the deal, leaving the English in the dark and feeling betrayed. Cardinal Guy, knowing the English had been used, wrote a sarcastic letter to Lancaster, mocking his plans. Lancaster was furious and responded by suggesting that there were other ways to invade France, and even hinted that he might consider extreme measures to achieve his goals. Despite the betrayal, Edward saw an opportunity. He realized that King John's desperate actions to secure peace with Charles revealed the weakness of the French monarchy. Edward sent negotiators to Guines, where a preliminary peace treaty was agreed upon. Edward would renounce his claim to the French throne in exchange for full sovereignty over a large part of Aquitaine and other territories. Both sides were optimistic, and the treaty was seen as a path to lasting peace. On April 30th, 1354, Edward addressed Parliament in the Painted Chamber at Westminster. He announced that there was hope for ending the war with France, but he couldn't reveal the details of the treaty yet. Parliament was enthusiastic, and the representatives overwhelmingly supported the idea of a permanent peace. Edward was optimistic and continued to spend money on his projects, and the country seemed to be on the path to prosperity. However, the mood changed when Lancaster arrived in Avignon to meet with the Pope. The French negotiators were not interested in the Treaty of Guines and were simply stalling for time. King John had decided it was better to restart the war, allowing him to punish Charles of Navarre and launch a major attack on Gascony. The negotiations failed, and Lancaster left Avignon in a rage, declaring that Edward was the rightful king of France. The disappointment in England was profound, and the failure of the treaty marked a significant setback for the English. Back in England, tensions were high. On February 10, 1355, a dispute over poor wine in a tavern in Oxford escalated into a full-scale riot. The conflict between the town and the university resulted in the deaths of over 20 townsmen and 63 scholars. Edward, determined to maintain justice, ruled in favor of the university and imposed a penalty on the town. The swift and decisive action demonstrated Edward's commitment to fairness and his ability to handle crises efficiently. The collapse of the Treaty of Guines had a profound impact on Edward. He was no longer content to wait and decided to take action. He ordered David II of Scotland, who was being held in Newcastle, to be returned to the Tower and canceled the negotiations for his ransom. When papal nuncios arrived in April, trying to extend the truce, Edward flatly refused, stating that the French had broken previous truces and he would not be fooled again. Edward's next move was to prepare for war. He planned a dual attack through Gascony and Normandy, with a third advance through Calais if necessary. Lancaster was appointed to lead the campaign in Normandy, and the Prince of Wales was to lead the forces in Gascony. Despite the experience of both leaders being in different regions, Edward had confidence in them. The Prince of Wales would be supported by several earls and a large number of men, including Welsh archers. However, the weather interfered with Edward's plans. The Prince of Wales was stuck at sea off Plymouth, and Lancaster was delayed off Sandwich. During the delays, Edward learned that Charles of Navarre had betrayed Lancaster again, planning to ambush the English army. Edward quickly changed his strategy, redirecting Lancaster to Brittany, and then decided to lead both his and Lancaster's forces to Calais. By the end of October, Edward and his army landed at Calais. Despite some setbacks, including the loss of alliances with Brabant and Germany, Edward's arrival attracted volunteers from other countries, bringing his total forces to about 10,000 men. Edward was in a confident and aggressive mood, and when he learned that a large French force was gathering at Amiens, he declared that he would go there and show King John the destruction he could bring. The stage was set for a new chapter in the war, with Edward determined to achieve his goals by any means necessary. On November 2nd, Edward set off on his journey to Amiens. 3 days later, his army was burning villages and fields as they approached their wont. Along the way, they met a French knight named Sir Jean Le Manger, better known as Boucicaut. Boucicaut had been captured in Gascony and was on parole, meaning he couldn't fight until he paid his ransom. However, this also meant he couldn't be punished for spying. Edward, curious, demanded to know where King John was. Boucicaut replied that John was still at Amiens. Edward was surprised, wondering why John was waiting there with such a large force, while his land was being destroyed by a much smaller English army. Edward knew Boucicaut was there to spy on his troops, so he let him see the well-equipped and confident English soldiers. The next day, as they destroyed the countryside around Hesdin, Edward told Boucicaut that he knew he was spying, but would let him go if he delivered a message to King John. The message was that Edward expected the French to be ready for battle within 3 days. Boucicaut did as he was told, but the 3 days passed without a French attack. John might have been unprepared or too scared to risk a battle. Edward was disappointed and beginning to regret his quick march south, as his supply lines were now vulnerable to French attacks around Calais, and his men were running out of wine. Drinking local water made them sick. With no sign of a French attack, Edward and his war leaders decided to try a tactic that had worked before at Crécy. They would pretend to retreat, hoping to lure the French into attacking them. King John took the bait. Eager to avoid being seen as his father, who often avoided battle, he sent his marshal to challenge Edward. Edward responded with a daring proposal. He suggested that the two kings should fight alone, the loser surrendering his claim to the French throne. If that was too much, Edward proposed that they each bring their eldest sons or a small group of knights. This was a way to prove his divine right to the throne, but King John refused, knowing that he and his son, the Dauphin Charles, couldn't match Edward and the Black Prince, who had already proven their prowess at Crécy. John turned down all of Edward's proposals, and the strategic initiative became a stalemate. Neither side was willing to attack on the other's chosen ground. Outside Calais, Edward realized he had made another serious mistake. On November 6th, while he was boasting to Boucicaut, a group of Scots led by a French knight had attacked and destroyed Berwick. This was a major setback for Edward, who had neglected to secure the northern border. He had assumed that David II's captivity would keep Scotland at peace. but he hadn't considered that French knights might help the Scots, or that Robert Stewart, the guardian of Scotland, might want to renew hostility. Cursing himself, Edward ordered Parliament to assemble at Westminster and issued a final challenge to King John, which was also rejected. Despite his bravado, Edward decided to retreat to Calais and then back to England. The 1355 campaign in Normandy was a failure, not because of the French, but because of his own strategic errors. Edward had to admit his mistakes and retreat to protect his kingdom's borders. 10 days after his last challenge, Edward was in the Painted Chamber at Westminster, surrounded by his nobles and representatives. He needed to secure financial support for a campaign against the Scots, and to renew his disappointing French campaign. Lord Manny, a respected champion, addressed the assembly, explaining the history of the conflict and the recent challenges. Chief Justice Cherchel added the loss of Berwick, and the need to respond to the Scottish incursion. The assembly agreed to grant a subsidy on wool and leather for 6 years, an unusually long period of taxation. Edward was given control of the kingdom's finances. However, there were conditions. The assembly presented several petitions, one of which caught Edward's attention. Lady Wake, his second cousin, complained that the Bishop of Ely had burned down some of her houses and murdered one of her servants. Edward, already concerned about law and order, ordered the bishop to humble himself and face justice. When the bishop refused, Edward was furious and began his journey north to deal with the Scots. By December, Edward was at Newcastle, and by January his army reached Berwick. The French who had led the attack on Berwick had already fled, and the Scottish defenders begged for mercy. Robert Stewart had not expected Edward to return so quickly, and the Scots were unprepared for his wrath. Edward was still angry about his retreat from France, and his fury only increased when he learned that his chancellor and treasurer had hesitated to confiscate the Bishop of Ely's lands. The campaign that followed became known as Burnt Candlemas. On January 25th, near Roxburgh Castle, Edward demanded that Balliol, the pretender to the Scottish throne, resign his title. Balliol was given a pension and left Scotland in disgrace. Edward then began a destructive march across Scotland, burning and destroying everything in a 20-mile wide path. He burned Edinburgh on Candlemas Day, February 2nd, and continued to Haddington, where he burned the friary. The harsh winter made the campaign even more difficult, as the Scots destroyed their own supplies to prevent the English from using them. Storms also damaged Edward's supply fleet, but he pushed on, punishing the Scots. The Burnt Candlemas campaign was incredibly destructive, but it did not end the war in Scotland. However, it was a powerful message to the Scots and the French. Edward believed that severe reprisals would make the Scots think twice before attacking England again at France's request. Soon after the campaign, Edward agreed to peace with the Scots and resumed negotiations to allow David II to return to his kingdom. The conflict with Scotland effectively ended, and David returned to his throne. The day on which David's ransom was to be paid in yearly installments was Candlemas, a stark reminder of Edward's brutal campaign. While historians often focus on the high cost of Edward's campaigns, it's important to note that the French were also struggling financially. By 1355, England had developed an efficient system for raising war funds, while France was nearly bankrupt. King John's financial troubles were compounded by personal issues, including failed attempts to meet Edward in battle and a plot to assassinate him. In 1356, another plot involving Charles of Navarre was foiled, and John reacted violently, executing several of the plotters and imprisoning Charles. This further destabilized the Norman aristocracy. In Normandy, Charles of Navarre's brother, Philip, sought protection from King Edward, willing to acknowledge English overlordship in return. This was a significant blow to John's authority, and it highlighted the growing strength of Edward's position in the ongoing conflict. In the year 1356, John, the King of France, faced a significant challenge from the Prince of Wales, who had launched a devastating raid through Gascony. The prince had set sail from England on September 9, 1355, and was welcomed warmly in Gascony. He led a successful raid through the region of Armagnac, reaching the walls of Carcassonne before returning to Bordeaux for Christmas. The destruction was massive, with entire towns, including Carcassonne and Limoux, reduced to ashes. The prince's men looted vast amounts of treasure, adding to John's financial troubles and even stealing financial documents to calculate the damage done to the French treasury. Back in England, King Edward III, the prince's father, was pleased with his son's success. Having subdued the Scots, Edward turned his attention to the French war. He aimed to persuade the French to accept the Treaty of Guines, which would end the conflict. To do this, he planned two simultaneous campaigns, one in the south, led by his son, and another in the north, led by the Duke of Lancaster. On May 2, 1356, the Pope's envoys asked Edward for a truce, but he refused. 6 weeks later, Lancaster's army, consisting of 800 archers and 500 men at arms, arrived in Normandy. They joined forces with Sir Robert Knowles and the King of Navarre's army. Lancaster's primary goal was to relieve the besieged castle of Breteul, but he did not attempt to link up with the prince in the south. The English forces under Lancaster destroyed the town and castle of Verneuil on July 5–6, and then prepared for a French counterattack. However, King John's army did not advance. The English retreated, leaving John to decide whether to defend Gascony, resume the siege of Breteul, or pursue Lancaster. Edward, worried about the outcome of these campaigns, endowed 3 chaplains to pray for the safety of his family, a rare move that showed his deep concern. Meanwhile, Edward's son, the Prince of Wales, continued his march from Bergerac on August 4th, heading north through Périgueux to Bourges. He hoped to meet up with his father, who was supposed to land in the north of France. When no news of his father's arrival came, the prince had to reassess his strategy. King John, with a large army, was at Orleans, and the Count of Poitiers was at Tours. The prince reached the outskirts of Tours on September 7th, hoping to see Lancaster's campfires. Finding none, he learned that the French royal army was marching south. The prince had no choice but to retreat. On September 18th, the prince's scouts found King John's army at Poitiers. The Cardinal Talleyrand offered the prince a chance to sue for peace, but the prince refused, playing for time by saying he needed his father's approval. The next day, September 19th, the French army advanced, and King John unfurled the oriflamme, ordering all English and Gascon prisoners to be killed, except for the prince. The English, with only 6,000 men, including about 1,000 archers, prepared for battle. They heard mass, said prayers, and the prince encouraged his men, dubbing several knights. The French launched 2 groups of 500 cavalry to break the English archers, but the marshals hesitated and then charged. The English vanguard, led by the Earl of Warwick, drove back the French crossbowmen. The French faltered, and the prince ordered a small contingent under Sir Jean de Grailly to attack the French from behind. The English, initially panicked, were rallied by the prince, who ordered them to advance. As they moved forward, the Captal de Butch attacked the French rear, causing confusion. The English and Gascons charged, and the battle raged. The French, including great nobles like Geoffrey de Charny, fought valiantly but were gradually overwhelmed. The English seized King John, and the battle ended in a decisive victory for the English. The news of the capture of King John spread quickly, and Edward III, upon hearing the news, was overjoyed. He rewarded the messenger and ordered the news to be announced throughout the country. The victory at Poitiers was a turning point in the war, marking England's rise as a dominant military power in Europe. The news of King John's capture at Poitiers sent waves of excitement through the English court. Edward, once seen as the king of a small, unimportant country, was now a force to be reckoned with. His letters were filled with international matters, and even the Holy Roman Emperor sought a treaty with him. The Navarrese and the Scots, once unreliable, now seemed willing to trust and negotiate. The Bishop of Ely fled to Avignon, realizing he couldn't stand up to a man now widely regarded as England's greatest king. Even the Pope recognized Edward's newfound power and wrote to him, begging for peace between King John of France and himself. With King John as his prisoner, Edward had a chance to reflect on what he truly wanted from the war. He had to decide if he would demand more territories, or if he would be satisfied with what he already had. The English people, feeling the divine favor on their side, were confident that Edward could ask for anything and get it. They joked that the Pope had become French and Jesus had become English, suggesting that the English were now blessed by God. After all, they had defeated the French in over a dozen battles, which seemed almost miraculous. Edward's demands, however, were surprisingly modest. He asked for the recognition of his sovereignty over several regions in France, including Aquitaine and Ponthieu, along with Calais and the surrounding areas. This was not much more than what had been agreed upon at Guines 3 years earlier. Edward believed the war was coming to an end, both in Scotland and France, and he decided to be merciful. He wanted to finalize the peace and exchange his French prisoners for a large ransom, which he set at 1 million marks, a huge sum of money. The truce with France was agreed upon in March 1357, but there was a minor issue. The Duke of Lancaster was still besieging Rennes and was reluctant to stop. He had sworn an oath to place his banner on the city's battlements, and as a deeply religious man, he felt he couldn't break his word. It took until July for him to find a compromise, entering Rennes alone to place his banner, and then returning to England. The English Parliament, still basking in the euphoria following Poitiers, was eager to support Edward's efforts for peace. When Parliament met in April, the religious tone was strong. A woman named Cecilia Ridgway, who had been wrongly accused of murder, was pardoned after she proved her innocence through a miraculous act. This reinforced the idea that Edward's reign was blessed by God. Parliament passed several important laws, including reforms to wool sales, wine measurements, and the legal system. They also agreed to a new year of direct taxation, more out of gratitude than necessity. On May 5, 1357, the Prince of Wales arrived in Plymouth with King John of France and his entourage. They were met with celebrations wherever they went. Edward even arranged a mock ambush by men dressed as forest dwellers, carrying bows and arrows, a nod to the popular Robin Hood stories. When they reached London, the city was transformed into a grand stage. The mayor and aldermen, dressed in bright costumes, greeted the royal party. The city's fountains flowed with wine, and the streets were lined with decorations and people. The procession was a spectacle, and the mood was one of triumph and joy. The capture of King John, along with his son Philip and other French nobles, made London the center of European attention. The city hosted a series of tournaments, including a nighttime event that was a marvel of medieval entertainment. Knights in plate armor jousted under the glow of torches and fires, watched by thousands of spectators. The highlight was the tournament at Windsor on St. George's Day in 1358, where Edward's new College of St. George was officially opened. The event was attended by nobles from across Europe, including Edward's sister, Queen Joan, and even his aging mother, Isabella. Isabella's presence at the Windsor tournament was a reminder of her continued influence in the royal family. She had been wrongly portrayed as a prisoner at Castle Rising, but in reality, she was a respected and active figure. Edward had always been close to her, despite the events of 1330, and he had restored her income and estates. They shared many interests, including alchemy, spirituality, and chivalric literature. Isabella was known for her love of jewels and her keen sense of fashion, much like Edward. Their bond was strong, and her death would deeply affect Edward. The First Treaty of London, ratified by King John in 1358, marked a significant step towards peace. The terms were similar to those agreed upon at Guines, and while the French faced the challenge of raising the ransom, the people of Paris were tired of war and welcomed the treaty. Edward believed he had been generous and fair, and the treaty was seen as a just conclusion to the long conflict. As Edward looked to the future, he was aware of the challenges that lay ahead. But the victory at Poitiers and the subsequent peace negotiations had solidified his position as one of the greatest kings England had ever known. The celebrations and tournaments were not just symbols of triumph. They were a reminder of the strength and unity of the English people under his rule. Edward's reign was a time of great achievement, and his legacy would be remembered for generations to come.